Greetings to my small YouTube community that isn't growing because the algorithm is absolute trash.
What the do you want from me? What the hell?
Welcome to yet another week of your favorite pixelated professor, the 8-Bit Academic. In today's episode, I am showcasing yet another blast from the past, which was released in the year 1998 called Bushido Blade 2, and is a sequel to 1997's Bushido Blade 1.
What? You don't say. You don't say. You don't say!
Now, to be honest, this footage you see here is of me playing this game for the very first time, and trying to figure out the mechanics and controls as I go along. Admittedly, I never owned a copy of Bushido Blade when I still had my PS1 console between the years of 2001 and 2005, after which I upgraded to a PS2. But I would always see the game in video rental stores where they would have a gaming section or at second-hand pawn shops, upon where I would make the promise to play it someday when I had the means to. After I had discovered the wonderful world of emulation, when I finally got my own PC, I would download it from one of the many ROM archive websites and proceed to let it collect virtual dust for many years to come, as I got too caught up with the trials and tribulations of adulting and trying to be a functional member of society, as well as other games which seem to be on a list that keeps growing and never getting time to play, as I continue to wishlist more and more indie titles on my Steam account.
Husband, you are so funny but please stop. We have to pay the bill.
The Bushido Blade games, as well as its spiritual successor on the PS2 called Kengo, Master of Bushido, were all developed by Lightweight Studios, who seem to be well known for making Hello Kitty games. As you can probably tell by the slow-paced gameplay, it isn't like other fighting games where you just button mash until someone's health bar is fully depleted. Instead, with these games, not only is there no health bar, but the game revolves around who is able to deal the killing blow first, so more focus is placed on strategy and attempting to outwit one's opponent rather than depleting a health bar with a series of combos. So of course, since I have decided to feature a game about samurai chopping each other to bits and pieces, today's topic will of course once again be about the samurai. What can I say, but Japanese history seems to be very fascinating. But to be honest, this is more about tapping into the hype with the recent release of the Ghost of Tsushima sequel called Ghost of Yotei, which, to the dismay of many self-proclaimed anti-woke basement-dwelling gamers who are most likely hardcore fans of Andrew Tate, features a female protagonist. Now, I myself have not played either of these two games yet, because as mentioned earlier, they belong to a long list of yet to play games on my Steam wishlist, which seem to be impossible to get to because being a responsible adult takes priority. So with that being said, I don't know if the developer Sucker Punch added in some hidden messages of modern day American feminist identity politics or not, but quite frankly, that isn't so much the focus of today's video topic. Rather, I would like to address some of the comments I've seen here and there about how the game is historically inaccurate because there were no female samurai in Japanese history. Well, the only thing I could say to that is, you're absolutely dead wrong. Yes, female warriors are extremely rare across cultures and even in Japan, since throughout history many traditions and social norms prevented women from participating in any military endeavors. Which, if you have been exposed to the horrors of war, whether directly through actual participation or indirectly by watching the many live leaks on social media of atrocities taking place in war zones around the world today, it kinda makes sense. And while what I'm about to say could be considered very controversial, why any woman out there would be championing the idea of allowing female soldiers in modern armies with how terrible and horrifying war is, I will never understand. Even I, as a man myself, would never want to participate in what is essentially a big murdering and dying contest for the conflicting interests and investments of global elites who look down upon us commoners from their shiny mansions and getaway retreats on islands where they engage in a bunch of diddy activities and doing other heinous things that would get us normal folks locked away for eternity. I might get a lot of flack for that because it's the internet and everyone has to be mad about something, but it is what it is.
Shut the fuck up! Know your fucking place, trash!
But just because these restrictions on female combatants have existed since ancient times to this day, doesn't mean that they have never existed at all. And even in Japan, there are many historical examples of women serving on the front lines with their fellow male compatriots, or sometimes even with their husbands and sons. Simply by being born into a noble family of the upper aristocratic warrior class of feudal Japan, a woman would already be considered a samurai. Since, as I had mentioned in my previous video on Yasuke, the samurai were more than just warriors, and that many samurai could even go their entire lives without even lifting a weapon for the purposes of battle. Not every samurai was a battle-hardened warrior, and not every battle-hardened warrior was a samurai, such as in the case of the peasant militiamen called the Ashigaru, who served under their samurai lords or daimyos as basically cannon fodder or meats for the meat grinder during majority of battles in feudal Japan's history. So just by being either born into one of the many samurai clans or being married to a samurai lord, a woman would automatically become a samurai, since it basically just meant that you belong to the privileged upper class of nobles and aristocrats who just happened to be Japan's main military force as well. Being of higher rank than the average merchant or peasant, or being just below the shogun or military ruler and the emperor, even though he was just a figurehead. But this begs the question though, did female samurai actually train in any sort of martial art or weapons-based combat, and are there any examples of female samurai who actually served in battle? Well, you'd be surprised to find out that not only was weapons training a requirement for female samurai, but that there are also quite a few extremely famous examples of women even engaging in battle alongside the men, with entire military regiments being made up exclusively of female combatants throughout Japanese history.
No way! Yes way!
Now, before we go on, a distinction needs to be made here, since female samurai who served in battle were given a completely different title from their male counterparts. While both sexes belonged to the same class known as the samurai, which specifically meant the aristocratic or noble warrior class in the Japanese social hierarchy of the time, which was for the most part earned through inheritance, as in you had to be born to one of the samurai clans to be considered a samurai. For either of the two sexes, male and female, there did exist specific titles under this main category, which referred to their warrior nature, especially those who had actual experience in warfare or who would go on to serve in warlike situations. For men, the term bushi was sometimes also used to refer to a male samurai. However, the term bushi could also be used for any type of male professional warrior or soldier, so even peasant ashigaru or mercenaries for hire could also be called bushi. Thus the term samurai was more commonly used to differentiate between bushi who were of the lower classes and those who were of the more noble upper classes. For women, female samurai or warriors were referred to as onamusha or onabugeisha, which basically just means female bushi or female samurai. And with regards to weapons, where the males would employ a wide variety ranging from the yari or spear, or the tachi or longsword, the katana or medium sword, or wakizashi or short sword, medieval firearms and bows and arrows, the preferred weapon of the female samurai or onamusha, or the weapon that has become most associated with them, is the naginata, which was a type of polearm that seemed to be a cross between a sword and a spear.
They call him Samurai. He speaks fluent Japanese.
Are you Fujiyama?
What does katana mean?
It means Japanese sword.
However, this didn't mean that onamusha did not train in or use other weapons as well. Many of them were in fact also highly skilled archers or marksmen.
Are you fucking serious right now? You're gonna misgender my dog in front of him? Right to his fucking face, dude?
I mean, markswomen, who were pretty good at using firearms such as the Tanegashima matchlock rifles of the latest samurai period. Just that the naginata was a pretty good weapon to use, and that an onabugeisha would spend most of her time training in its use, since it was pretty good at dealing with enemies from a distance if a melee situation ever arose on a battlefield. As with any polearm or spear-based weapon, long pointy sticks were far more effective when fighting in formation on a battlefield than short stabby and cutty ones, since you could shank an enemy in the throat from a distance. Now, the idea behind this thinking of, hey, maybe the woman should learn how to fight as well, was that during the feudal era from 1185 AD to 1603 AD, war was so commonplace, especially during the Sengoku Jidai from 1467 to 1615, that if there was ever a shortage of men due to a high number of casualties on the battlefield, women would end up having to take up arms to defend their homes and their families from any invading force that may seek to destroy or capture their territories, and on the very rare occasion may even end up serving on the battlefield alongside the men as reserves. The earliest example of a female warrior being mentioned in Japanese history was during the Yayoi period, which lasted from 300 BC to 300 AD, and this specific semi-historical figure was in fact the last de facto ruler of Japan at the time, named Empress Jingu. I say semi-historical because it seems like much of her story has become mostly mythical over time. Empress Jingu was a legendary Japanese empress who ruled as a regent following her husband Emperor Chuai's death in 200 AD at the hands of rebel forces, whom she in turn annihilated in a fit of rage by leading a military campaign against them. Both the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki chronicles record events that took place during Jingu's alleged lifetime. Legends say that after seeking revenge on the people who murdered her husband, she then turned her attention to a promised land. Jingu is thus considered to be a controversial monarch by historians in terms of her alleged invasion of the Korean peninsula, and this entire idea was then later used by the Japanese army and government as justification for imperial expansion during the Meiji period from 1868 to 1912, and the following Taisho and early Showa era from 1912 to 1945, which saw Japan first invade Korea and eventually other parts of East Asia such as China and the Philippines in their attempt to create their own colonial empire in the East to rival those of the West. The records state that Jingu gave birth to a baby boy named Homu Tawake 3 years after he was conceived by her late husband. I'm pretty sure that's not how it works.
That's not how it works. That's not how any of this works.
Jingu's reign is conventionally considered to have been from 201 to 269 AD, and was considered to be the 15th Japanese imperial ruler until the aforementioned Meiji period, from the mid-19th century to the early 20th century. Modern historians have come to the conclusion that the name Jingu was used by later generations to describe this legendary empress, with her real name somewhat being up in the air. It has also been proposed that Jingu actually reigned later than she is attested to have, and while the location of Jingu's grave, if any exists, is unknown, she is traditionally venerated at local shrines. It is mostly accepted today that Empress Jingu reigned as a regent until her son became Emperor Ojin upon her death. According to the Nihon Shoki, the king of Baekje of Korea gifted Jingu with a 7-branched sword sometime in 253 AD. However, despite the legends surrounding this mysterious Japanese warrior empress, the narrative of her invading and conquering the Korean peninsula is now considered very controversial, probably due to Japanese and Korean tensions in the past, and a tad bit of leftover resentment due to those same past tensions, which leaves this particular part of the Jingu story currently up for debate, due to the complete lack of evidence and involvement of both the Japanese and Korean points of view, with one side saying it definitely did happen and the other side saying it totally did not, and actual historians being stuck in between trying to pass through all the propaganda to find out what really took place. Then there is also the mention of 2 famous female warriors from the last days of the Heian period and the Genpei War in 1185 AD, which was the deciding conflict that saw the samurai become the ruling class of Japan under the authority of the shogun, and the imperial family being relegated to simply being symbolic figureheads. The first of these legendary female samurai is the highly famous Tomoe Gozen. Her story appears in the semi-mythical tale of the Heike, which details the very real events of political turmoil and violent clashes leading up to the Genpei War, as well as recounting the many great battles of the war itself between the Taira and Minamoto clans for control of Japan. The reason the tale of the Heike is regarded as semi-mythical despite being based off real events of the time is because there is also a high level of anime-like embellishment that takes place, such as real-life samurai Minamoto no Yoshitsune and his trusty sidekick warrior monk Benkei taking on the ghosts of fallen Taira clan warriors while at sea. Now, it must be stated that there is doubt as to whether Tomoe Gozen even existed, as she does not seem to appear in any primary accounts of the Genpei War. However, it is claimed in the tale of the Heike that she supposedly served under the samurai lord Minamoto no Yoshinaka during the war. While in service to her lord Yoshinaka, she commanded about 300 samurai against 2,000 warriors of the rival Taira clan. After defeating the Taira in 1182 and driving them into the western provinces, her lord Yoshinaka was able to take Kyoto and desired to be the leader of the Minamoto clan. However, due to family rivalries, whenever leadership and succession became an issue, his cousin Minamoto no Yoritomo felt threatened since he too wanted to be in charge and decided to crush him, and sent his brothers Yoshitsune and Noriyori to kill him. This family rivalry over who gets to be the guy led to a very violent dick measuring contest at Awazu, which was basically a small-scale civil war between these members of the Minamoto clan, where they decided to settle family issues first before going on to essentially erase the Taira clan from existence. Minamoto no Yoshinaka fought Minamoto no Yoritomo's forces at the Battle of Awazu on February the 21st in 1184 AD. It is here where bad bitch Tomoe Gozen's story would be engraved into legend, since it is here where she would face off with Onda no Hachiro, or sometimes also known as Onda no Morishige, a highly skilled and powerful warrior from Musashi province, whom she would end up defeating and cutting off his head as a trophy for her lord Yoshinaka. Although Yoshinaka's troops fought bravely, they were outnumbered and eventually overwhelmed. When Yoshinaka's forces were decimated with only a few of his soldiers remaining, he supposedly told Tomoe Gozen to flee because he wanted to die with his foster brother Imai no Kanira, who was also his closest ally and most loyal retainer, since they had been raised together. There are varied accounts of what followed after this event, where Tomoe Gozen is said to have also killed another samurai of the Minamoto clan, named Uchida Ieyoshi, and also for escaping capture Bahata Keyama Shigetada, who initially fought on the side of the Taira clan during the Genpei War but eventually switched sides to the Minamoto clan. Another honorable mention would be that of Lady Hangaku, or Hangaku Gozen, who just like Tomoe was said to have lived around the time of the end of the Heian period, an early Kamakura period after the Genpei War, and whose story has also been recounted in many Japanese tales as well as in No and Kabuki theatre throughout history. Hangaku Gozen was a member of the Taira clan and lived with her family in Echigo after the Taira were defeated during the Genpei War. She was the daughter of Taira clan general Jo Sukenaga, who was defeated by the previously mentioned Minamoto no Yoshinaka in a battle during the Genpei War. However, some sources that I found online state that he may have died of disease before he was able to even lead his forces to the front lines, so I'm not entirely sure of what actually happened to him, since there is very little information about him online other than him being Hangaku Gozen's father. Hangaku later joined her uncle Jo Nagamochi and her cousin Jo Sukemori in the Kenin Rebellion of 1201 AD, which was one final attempt by former loyalists of the Taira clan to regain their power and overthrow the Kamakura shogunate, led by the Minamoto clan. Hangaku Gozen became an integral part of their defensive operation at Torisaka Castle and was noted for her leadership and bravery during the 3-month-long defense, during which she and her cousin Sukemori led forces of soldiers against armies who were loyal to the Kamakura shogunate. Unfortunately though, they could not prevail against the might of the Kamakura shogun's armies, and their rebel defenses were eventually struck down. It is said though that Hangaku kept on fighting until she was wounded by an arrow that pierced her thigh.
Say the line, Bart!
I used to be an adventurer like you. Then I took an arrow in the knee.
She was captured and presented as a prisoner of war to the shogun Minamoto no Yoriie, who was intrigued by her beauty and reputation, proclaiming her to be as fearless as a man but as beautiful as a flower. Lady Hangaku, who wanted to preserve her family's honor by way of seppuku or ritual suicide, was prevented from doing so by the shogun's orders and was instead given to marry one of his retainers named Asari Yoshito, with whom she would have a child and live out the rest of her days in Kai province, after which she kinda disappears from the historical record, since not much of her later life was ever written about. Now, so far these examples I have mentioned seem to tread the line between being historical fiction and historical fact, since as I had mentioned before, much of their recorded lives have been heavily exaggerated and mystified to the point of sounding more like legends and myths rather than actual historical events. But regardless of this, the stories of these 3 women prove that the idea of warrior women who actually served in battle was not a foreign concept to the Japanese, which leads me to believe that they were either based on real people or that there may have been situations or events wherein women did indeed perform impressive feats on the battlefield that led to them being immortalized in such stories, since I personally am of the opinion that every myth or legend is indeed based on truthful occurrences throughout history. Even during the absolute chaos that was the Sengoku period, from 1467 to 1615, depending on which historian you ask, which was basically a massive shitfest that got shittier as the decades rolled on due to never-ending famine and constant civil war that lasted over 150 years, because of various samurai clans fighting for control and peasants being sick and tired of being walked all over by the samurai class. There were many examples as well of women who would take up arms and pledge their service on the battlefield, from both the samurai class and the general populace. In fact, one could make the case that this was more common during this era, since due to the constant state of civil war, an extremely high number of male deaths as a result of this, someone needed to fill the ranks of armies who were losing manpower on a regular basis. And in many instances, this led to women being called upon as well to engage in these grueling battles for absolute control of a now totally fractured Japan. In 1460, when Shogun Ashikaga Yoshimasa abdicated his position to his younger brother Ashikaga Yoshimi, a woman named Hino Tomiko, who was Yoshimasa's wife, was strongly against this decision. Tomiko sought political and military support to rule as regent of Japan until the birth of her son, whom she wanted to be the next shogun. Securing the support of samurai lord Yamana Sozen and other leaders of powerful samurai clans. She went to war against her husband Yoshimasa and his supporters, especially the Hosokawa clan. This dispute for succession started the Onin War from 1467 to 1477 and led to the beginning of the Sengoku period. Now, aside from this being probably the most hardcore couples disputes in human history, in my previous video on Yasuke, I had mentioned that the Kyotoku incident of 1454 was the start of the Sengoku period, but as someone pointed out to me in the comments back then, that most historians regard the Onin War as the beginning of this violent period in Japanese history. However, I did find in my own research that while the Kyotoku incident isn't the exact starting point, it was one of the many events that led to the Onin War and the start of the Sengoku Jidai, in which majority of samurai-related media tend to take place, and is the one time period that gets referenced whenever we think of the samurai, since it is the most documented. In the later Sengoku period, there were a handful of incidents where at least several samurai, lords or daimyo woke up one day and each individually decided, fuck the system, and proceeded to go to war with each other over territory. Many women of noble clans and even peasant women, members of iko-iki or civilian militia groups, took up arms and went to the battlefields. In 1569, when a Mori clan family retainer from western Japan went missing from a campaign, his wife, Ichikawa no Tsubone, assumed responsibility for the defense of Konomine Castle, with her armed ladies-in-waiting and the rest of the castle's military force. There is even the story of a Shinto priestess named Ohori Tsuruhime, also known as Orohime, who is often referred to as the Japanese Joan of Arc. Orohime was not born of noble blood and did not belong to any of the samurai clans, but rather led a life of religious devotion, being born to Ohori Yasumochi, the chief priest of the Oyamazumi Shrine on Omishima Island, north of Iyo province. This shrine was dedicated to the deity Oyamatsumi, the brother of the sun goddess Amaterasu, in the Shinto folk religion in Japan. It also served as a site of pilgrimage to many samurai who would often leave behind weapons and armor as offerings. So Orohime was not a stranger to the ways of the samurai at all, and herself was trained in martial arts, as was customary for many Shinto religious devotees, in order to defend these shrines from desecration and looting. At that time, the island was under threat from the growing power of a warlord named Ouchi Yoshitaka. In 1534, a war broke out between the Ouchi clan and the Kono clan, under whose control and protection was the aforementioned Oyamatsumi temple, since it was located within their territories. In 1541, when Tsuruhime was 15 years old, her father died of illness and she inherited the position of chief priest of the shrine. And when the Ouchi clan made further attacks against Omishima, she led an armed resistance to defend the island. And just like Joan of Arc did by proclaiming herself to be a messenger of God during the 100 Years' War between France and England, so too would Ohori Tsuruhime proclaim herself to be the living avatar of Myojin of Mishima, an amalgamation of the kami or deities Oyamazumi no Kami and his consort Kotoshiru Nushi no Kami, who were worshipped at the shrine. She raised an army of peasant militia and fellow Shinto warriors, and drove the Ouchi samurai back into the sea when they attempted to raid Omoshima in 1541. Her story goes on to state that when the invaders returned with reinforcements, she led a surprise attack against their ships, blowing many of them up with makeshift explosives and killing an Ouchi clan general named Ohara Takakoto in a duel. During the Sengoku period, there are many more accounts of women fighting actively on the battlefield or leading armies into battle, such as the cases of Yoshioka Miorin, who inspired the peasants to form their own Iko-Iki militia group to fight against 3,000 invading Shimazu clan soldiers. Kai Hime, who fought against the Toyotomi clan in the siege of Oshi in 1590, or Nami Hime, who became the representative leader of the Nikaido clan and fought in various battles against her nephew Date Masamune, as well as another Onamusha named Akai Teruko, who became famous for fighting until she was 76 years old and became known as the strongest woman in the Warring States period. In the 16th century, which was the height of the Sengoku Jidai, there were many combat units consisting only of women, as was the case of the female warrior Ikeda Sen, who led 200 women musketeers in the Battle of Shizukatake. Otazu no Kata fought alongside 18 armed maids against Tokugawa Ieyasu's troops. Ueno Tsuruhime led 34 women in a suicidal charge against the Mori army, and Tachibana Ginchiyo, de facto leader of the Tachibana clan since her father had no sons, fought with her female troops in the Kyushu campaign in 1586 and in the siege of Yanagawa in 1600, where she organized a resistance formed by Buddhist nuns against the advance of the Eastern Army. And there are many more examples I could mention about women going to war during the Sengoku period, but this video is already quite lengthy, so let's skip ahead to the Edo period and finally conclude with the Boshin War and Satsuma rebellions during the Meiji Restoration. Throughout much of the Edo period, the role of the Onamusha or female samurai warrior had diminished greatly, and many samurai women essentially ended up working in the kitchen and making sandwiches for their powerful samurai husbands. This was mainly due to the Edo period being a time of lasting peace and stability, after Tokugawa Ieyasu stamped out the last remnants of ambitiously violent samurai clans of the Sengoku period during the Battle of Sekigahara in 1603, though some scholars argue that the Siege of Osaka in 1615 should be considered the start of the Edo period, but f*** those guys, we won't listen to them. Because of the influence of Edo-era Neo-Confucianism between 1600 and 1868, the status of the Onamusha had been downgraded significantly. Their duties became more focused on the home, whilst their husbands became government bureaucrats or police agents. Travel during the Edo period was demanding and unsettling for many female samurai due to tight restrictions. They always had to be accompanied by a man, since they were not allowed to travel by themselves. Additionally, they had to possess specific permits establishing their business and motives. The onset of the 17th century marked a significant transformation in the social acceptance of women in Japan. Many samurai viewed women purely as childbearers. The concept of a woman being a fit companion for war was no longer conceivable. The relationship between a husband and wife could be correlated to that of a lord and his vassal. Now, despite a few examples of Onamusha who still trained in the way of the sword, even though it was peacetime, like that of Sasaki Rui, for the most part, the female samurai spirit had effectively been snuffed out, and it would only be until the mid to late 1800s when we would see women once again take to the battlefield to fight alongside their male counterpart in what was essentially the final chapter in the long legacy of the samurai. Now, to set the stage for this final chapter of today's episode, we first have to take a look at what exactly the Meiji Restoration was. Aside from being highly conservative and strict in terms of its cultural and societal norms, the Edo period was also extremely isolationist, meaning that they wanted absolutely nothing to do with any foreign nations, and trade with either European or other East Asian countries was restricted and tightly controlled. It wasn't until an American Navy fleet led by Commodore Matthew Perry arrived on Japanese shores in 1853, and through intimidation forced Japan to open up ports for trade between the two nations, that the emperor, who had up until this point only been a political figurehead with real power being in the hands of the shogun, began to realize just how far behind the rest of the world Japan really was in terms of technological and cultural development. This incident freaked him out so much that he decided to do something about it, especially after seeing what Britain, Russia and France had already begun doing to many other countries in the Far East, and most notably to Japan's closest neighbor, China, with the British having already annihilated the Chinese Navy during the First Opium War between 1839 and 1845, thanks to superior military technology, forcing China to make concessions that basically allowed the Europeans to colonize certain regions and make the Chinese bow to their will. Thus, Emperor Meiji of Japan started what today is known as the Meiji Restoration, in an attempt to quickly modernize Japan, politically, culturally and militarily, and finally demanding that political power be restored to the imperial house in 1868, in an attempt to become advanced enough to curb any attempts at colonization or manipulation by the ever-expanding European powers, and also because he felt that the shogun and the ruling samurai class in Japan at the time were too caught up in tradition and the old ways to pay attention to what was going on in the rest of the world. One of the major milestones that Emperor Meiji initiated was the formation of a standardized national army, made up of ordinary civilians recruited and trained in the use of modern military tactics, weapons, and other kinds of advanced technology that existed at the time. Now, the samurai of the Tokugawa shogunate were not too happy about this at all, since this not only threatened their very identity, their hundreds of years of tradition and culture, and their legacy, but also their position as the upper ruling class of Japanese society. So in early 1868, they started the Boshin War, a civil war that saw many of the samurai clans banding together to take on the newly formed imperial army, which ultimately ended with the samurai being defeated because their military strategies and weapons were too outdated in comparison to the more modern tactics and weaponry of the Japanese military. There would be one final attempt in 1877 with the Satsuma Rebellion, but these last remaining rebel samurai were quickly crushed within just a few months, and the long-running samurai legacy had finally come to an end. In both of these conflicts, there are a handful of women who participated as well on the side of the samurai. In 1868, during the Battle of Aizu in the Boshin War, Nakano Takeko, a member of the Aizu clan, was recruited to become leader of a female military corps called the Joshitai, or Girls' Army, which fought against the onslaught of 20,000 soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army of the Ogaki Domain. Highly skilled at the naginata, Takeko and her corps of about 20 women joined 3,000 other Aizu samurai in battle. When the imperial troops realized that their enemies were female warriors, their commanders gave orders not to shoot at them. This gave Nakano's warriors an opportunity to attack. They killed several of their enemies before the imperial troops finally opened fire. Nakano was wounded by a bullet to the chest. Rather than letting the enemy take possession of her head as a trophy, she decided to go out like a badass, and Nakano asked her sister Yuko to behead her in order to prevent her capture, as well as to give her an honorable burial. Yuko agreed to her sister's request and asked for the assistance of fellow Aizu soldier Ueno Yoshisaburo to help with the beheading. After the battle, Nakano's head was taken by her sister to the nearby Hokkai temple of her family in the modern-day prefecture of Fukushima and buried with honor by the priest under a pine tree. Her weapon, which was the classic naginata associated with female samurai, was also donated to the temple. Another woman who served alongside Nakano was Nijima Yae, also known as Yamanato Yaeko, who was highly skilled in the use of firearms, However, unlike Nakano, she survived the battle and would go on to become a member of the Japanese Red Cross and eventually join the Imperial Army as a military medic and nurse, where she would serve on the front lines of both the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894 and the Russo-Japanese War in 1904, being one of the first women outside of the Imperial House of Japan to receive honors for her service to her country. Then there is also Yamakawa Futaba and the aristocratic Matsudaira Teru, who both participated in the defense of Tsuruga Castle during the Boshin War as well. As for the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, there did also exist a women's brigade who, under the slogan "New Government, High Morality," marched into battle alongside their male samurai peers in one final stand against the newly empowered imperial government, whom they perceived as unjust and corrupt. So there you have it, folks, the many examples of female samurai throughout Japanese history, which proves that Ghost of Yotei isn't so woke after all, though it does seem like the main character of Ghost of Yotei is more of a ronin or masterless samurai rather than a samurai in service to a local warlord, and I'm not sure if there were any female ronin wandering around Japan like some anime main protagonist. But regardless, history is often full of surprises and can more often than not subvert one's expectations, and I think this fits quite well for the female warriors or onamusha of feudal Japan, who didn't just talk the talk but walk the walk as well. And if you ask me, all these legendary ladies I mentioned here today are the truest form of female empowerment and real examples of what a historical feminist icon should be. Anyway, that's it from me for today. Thank you once again for sticking it through to the end and watching this video, and I'll see you all again next time with a brand new episode of the 8-Bit Academic.
Hey,